The war room of the Fang of Arxis smelled like cold metal and old blood. And Grand Warlord Ketharon liked it that way, because it reminded everyone who entered that he was not a creature who dealt in mercy. He stood at the center of the room, towering over the holographic map that floated above the command table like a ghost made of light, his scaled body wrapped in ceremonial armor that had been forged from the bones of a species that no longer existed because they had once told him no. Around him sat his 12 generals, each one a veteran of campaigns that had crushed entire civilizations into dust and silence, and every single one of them was waiting for him to speak, because when Ketharon was quiet, it usually meant something terrible was about to happen to someone. "The humans have refused our final offer," he said, and his voice was the sound of gravel dragged across stone. General Vraxis, the oldest of the 12, leaned forward and said that they should simply bomb the colony from orbit and be done with it, because the Arxelian fleet had enough firepower to turn the planet's surface into glass within a single rotation. Ketharon shook his massive head, and his neck spines rattled with irritation, because Vraxis always wanted to bomb things, and bombing was boring, and it taught no one anything. "If we burn them from the sky, they become martyrs," Ketharon said. "And martyrs are more dangerous than soldiers, because you cannot kill an idea with a plasma cannon." He tapped the holographic map, and it zoomed in on a planet that glowed blue and green like a jewel sitting in the black velvet of space, and the name floated beside it in pale letters that read Nueva Esperanza. It was humanity's third largest colony, a world of wide golden plains and thick forests and rivers that cut through mountain ranges like silver threads. And it was home to 90 million humans who had built cities and farms and lives there, without ever asking permission from the Arxelian Dominion. "We will not burn them," Ketharon said, and a smile crept across his face that showed every one of his 300 teeth. "We will break them." He pressed a command into the table, and a new image appeared, and every general in the room went very still when they saw it, because they all knew what it was and what it meant. The image showed Azrak Val. It stood 4 meters tall in the hologram, a nightmare made of muscle and bone and fury, its body covered in bioceramic armor that could stop most conventional weapons, its mouth filled with teeth that could bite through steel plating, and its eyes burned with a terrible intelligence that was not quite animal and not quite sapient, but something far worse than either. The Azrak Val were the pride of the Arxelian war machine, gene-spliced from the deadliest predators across 100 conquered worlds, and then twisted and enhanced and perfected over time. Decades of breeding, until they were the most efficient killing things the galaxy had ever produced. They had venomous spines along their backs that could paralyze a grown Arxelian in seconds, regenerative tissue that could heal a bullet wound in minutes, and a pack-hunting intelligence that allowed them to coordinate attacks with a precision that most armies would envy. And they had never failed. 43 species had faced this rock Val, and every single one had broken, had surrendered, had begged on their knees for the killing to stop, and the Arxelian Dominion had welcomed them into servitude with open arms and closed fists. "We dropped 40,000 on Nueva Esperanza," Ketharon said. "We let them run wild across the countryside, and we let the humans see what real predators look like, and within 1 week they will be screaming for mercy, and the rest of their little civilization will hear those screams, and they will kneel." Would happen if the humans chose to fight instead of surrender. And Ketharon laughed so hard that the sound echoed off the metal walls like thunder in a canyon. "Fight?" he said. "They are soft little creatures with no claws and no armor and no venom, and they live on a world where the most dangerous thing they face is bad weather. And you think they will fight the Azrak Val?" He waved his hand as if brushing away an insect. "They will run," he said. "They always run." The order was given, and the great bioships in the Arxelian fleet began to stir, as 40,000 Rockval were loaded into drop pods that looked like iron eggs filled with death. And the beasts inside them howled and thrashed and slammed against their containment fields because they could smell a world below them, and they were hungry. The pods were programmed to scatter across Nueva Esperanza's 3 major continents. To land in the rural areas first, where the population was thin, response would be slow, and to let the beasts establish territory before the humans even understood what was happening. Ketharon watched the launch from the observation deck of his flagship, and the pods fell away from the fleet like a swarm of dark seeds dropping toward fertile ground. And he felt the satisfaction of a predator who knows that the trap has already closed. Far below, on the surface of Nueva Esperanza, night was falling over the eastern plains, and the sky was turning the color of copper and amber as the sun sank behind the distant mountains. Lucia Montero stood on the porch of her farmhouse and watched the sky the way she did every evening, because she loved the way the colors changed and shifted like a painting that was never finished. And she held a cup of coffee in one hand and breathed in the smell of the fields that stretched out around her home in every direction. She was 34 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a braid that were rough from years of working the land, and eyes that were sharp enough to spot a hawk circling 3 kilometers away. And she had lived on this farm her entire life, and she knew every hill and valley and stream within 50 kilometers, like she knew the lines on her own palms. She noticed the lights in the sky first, tiny streaks of fire that could have been shooting stars, except there were too many of them, and they were moving too slowly, and they were getting bigger. She set down her coffee and walked to the edge of the porch, and watched as the streaks became trails of flame that stretched across the darkening sky like burning fingers reaching for the ground. And she counted them, and stopped counting when she reached 200, because there were far too many to count. The first one hit the ground about 10 kilometers to the north, and the impact shook the earth beneath her feet, and sent a pillar of dust and fire into the air that lit up the horizon like a hawk. Second sunset. Then another hit, and another, and another, and the sky was full of them, and the ground was shaking like the planet itself was afraid. Lucia Montero did not scream, and she did not run inside, and she did not call for help, because she had been born on a frontier world, and frontier people did not panic when the sky fell down around them. Instead, she walked back into her house, and she took her hunting rifle down from the rack above the fireplace. And she checked the magazine, and she chambered around, and she walked back out onto the porch, and she sat down in her chair, and she watched the horizon where the fires were burning, and she waited. Because whatever had just fallen out of the sky was going to have to come through her land to get anywhere else. And Lucia Montero had never let anything take what was hers without a fight. The first Zrock vole crawled out of its smoking pod in a wheat field 6 kilometers north of the town of San Marcos, and it stood in the moonlight and raised its massive head and tasted the air with a tongue that could detect blood from 2 kilometers away. It was hungry, and it was angry, and it had been bred for one purpose, and that purpose was to make everything around it afraid. Within an hour, the creature had killed 14 cattle and 3 dogs, and it had torn through the wall of a farmhouse like it was made of paper, and it had dragged a man into the darkness while his family screamed. And by the time the local police arrived, the beast had already moved on, because it did not stay in one place, because staying in one place was not how you created terror. Across the planet, the same scene was playing out 1,000 times over, as 40,000 Zrock vole erupted from their pods, and began to do exactly what they had been designed to do. Nightmare that would scar Nueva Esperanza for generations. 6,211 people died before dawn. In orbit above the planet, Grand Warlord Ketharon watched the surveillance footage on his command screen, and he nodded slowly, because everything was going exactly as planned, and the kill numbers were right on schedule, and soon the begging would begin. He had seen it 43 times before, with 43 different species, and it always went the same way because fear was the oldest weapon in the universe, and nothing beat fear. But Kethveron had made a mistake that he did not yet understand. And the mistake was this. He had studied human technology and human military strength and human diplomatic patterns, but he had never once studied human history, because he considered humans too young and too primitive for their history to matter. If he had read even a single book about the human past, he would have learned that this was a species that had once hunted woolly mammoths with pointed sticks, a species that had tamed wolves and ridden horses and crossed oceans in wooden boats just to see what was on the other side, a species that responded to every natural disaster and plague and war, not by surrendering, but by getting angry and getting organized and getting even. Governor Elena Vasquez was in her office in the capital city of Puerto Nuevo when the reports started coming in, and she listened to every single one with a face that could have been carved from stone, because Elena Vasquez had not become governor of a frontier colony by being the kind of woman who fell apart when things went wrong. By the time the sun rose over the eastern plains, she had already activated the Colonial Militia Act, which meant that every citizen with combat training or hunting experience was now authorized to carry weapons and organize into defense units, and she had opened every military armory on the planet to civilian access, had sent a message to Earth requesting fleet support that she knew would take weeks to arrive. "We are not evacuating," she told her advisors when they suggested it. 90 million people cannot be evacuated, and I will not ask them to abandon their homes because some overgrown lizard thinks he can scare us into submission. 300 kilometers to the south, in a farmhouse that smelled like chemicals and old books, a retired xenobiologist named Dr. Tomas Herrera was doing something that no other species had ever thought to do when faced with a Jrach Vol. He was cutting one open. The beast had been wounded by a truck that had hit it on a highway at full speed, and it had crashed through the windshield and killed the driver. But the impact had shattered its left legs, and it had crawled into a ditch, where Tomas and his 2 adult sons had found it and killed it with a logging axe and a shotgun. Now it lay on his barn floor in a pool of dark blood, and Tomas was elbow deep in its chest cavity, with a camera drone floating over his shoulder, broadcasting everything he found to the Planetary Emergency Network. "The armor is not uniform," he said into the camera. "There are gaps at every joint, and the plating on the underbelly is thinner than the rest. And if you look here at the base of the skull, there is a cluster of nerve tissue about the size of my fist that appears to be the central processing node for the entire nervous system." He held up a glistening lump of tissue that pulsed faintly in the light. "One shot here, and the creature drops instantly," he said. "It does not matter how big it is or how fast it regenerates, because without this node, it is dead before it hits the ground." He also discovered that the venom glands in the creature's spines broke down completely when exposed to ethanol, which meant that common alcohol could neutralize the one weapon that made the Jrach Vol most terrifying. And he noted this with the calm, scientific detachment of a man who had spent his career studying alien biology and was not about to let an oversized monster ruin his retirement. The broadcast reached every settlement on the planet within the hour, and people watched it the way their ancestors had once gathered around fires to hear hunters describe the weaknesses of the beasts that stalked them in the dark. And something shifted in the collective mood of Nueva Esperanza, like a great wheel turning. Fear did not disappear because fear is a natural thing, and only a fool feels no fear. But alongside the fear something else rose up, and it was older than fear and stronger than fear, and it was the thing that had kept humanity alive through ice ages and plagues and wars that had burned entire continents. It was the cold and simple knowledge that they were not prey. Lucia Montero had not slept since the pods fell, and she had spent the night on her porch with her rifle across her knees, listening to the breeze. Sounds of something large moving through the wheat fields to the north. And when dawn came, she saw the tracks in the soft earth near her fence line, and they were the size of dinner plates, and they were deep enough to tell her that whatever made them was very heavy and very close. She watched the broadcast from Dr. Herrera on her phone, and she memorized the weak points the way she had memorized the anatomy of every animal she had ever hunted since her father first put a rifle in her hands when she was 11 years old. At noon, the beast came. It walked out of the tall wheat like a shadow given solid form. 4 meters of armored death, with eyes that glowed amber in the sunlight. And it saw Lucia standing on her porch, and it lowered its head, and its spines rose along its back like a crown of needles, and it began to charge. Lucia raised her rifle, and she did not shake, and she did not hesitate, because she had been shooting since before she could read. 300 meters, and the target was the base of the skull, just below where the armor plates met. And she had made harder shots than this on running deer in bad weather. She fired once. The Jrocvol stumbled mid-stride as if it had run into an invisible wall, and its legs folded beneath it, and it slid forward through the dirt, and came to a stop 15 meters from her porch steps, and it did not move again. Lucia stood there for a moment, looking at the massive body cooling in the dust, and then she chambered another round, and walked down the steps, and checked that it was dead. And then she went back to her porch and picked up the phone, and called her neighbor Rosa, and said that there were more of them in the wheat fields, and they should probably get some people together before dark. By the time the sun set on the second day, Lucia had killed 3 more, and she was not the only one, because across the planet, humans were doing what humans had always done when a predator entered their territory. They were hunting it back. In orbit, Grand Warlord Kethvaron received a report that confused him, because the numbers were wrong and the pattern was wrong, and instead of mass evacuation from the rural areas, the surveillance showed humans moving toward the beasts rather than away from them. And his intelligence officer used a word that Kethvaron had never heard applied to a Jrocvol deployment before. The word was casualties, and it referred not to the humans, but to the beasts. Kethvaron read the report twice, and then he set it aside, and told his officers that it was a statistical anomaly, and that the humans would break soon, because they always did, because every species always did. He was wrong about that, but he did not know it yet. By the 4th day, the scattered resistance had begun to grow roots, and those roots spread fast, because humans were very good at 2 things that the Arxelians had never accounted for. And those things were talking to each other and solving problems together. Every settlement on Nueva Esperanza had access to the planetary network, and within that network, a war was being organized, not by generals or politicians, but by ordinary people who refused to sit in the dark and wait to die. Farmers shared maps of beast migration patterns they had tracked from their fields. Hunters posted videos showing the best angles for kill shots at the skull base. Engineers uploaded blueprints for reinforced barriers that could slow a charging Jrocvol long enough for a shooter to line up. And a teenager in the port city of Bahia Larga created a real-time tracking application that used civilian drone footage to mark beast locations across the entire planet. Imperfect, and it was the most dangerous thing that any prey species had ever done to the Jrocvol, because it meant that every single human on the planet was learning how to kill them at the same time. Militia General Carlos Riva arrived in Puerto Nuevo on the 5th day after a hard burn from the neighboring colony of Tierra Firme, where he had been teaching at the military academy, and he was a man who looked like he had been built out of leather and iron wire and bad decisions, with a face that had more scars than smooth skin, and a reputation for being the kind of officer who won ugly and did not apologize for it. Governor Vasquez gave him full authority over the planetary defense, and he sat down with the data that had been pouring in from every corner of Nueva Esperanza, and he studied it for 6 hours without speaking, and then he stood up and he smiled, and it was not a nice smile. "These things are smart," he said, "but they are not smarter than us, and they have a pattern, and patterns can be broken." He divided the planet into hunting zones based on terrain and population density, and he assigned militia units to each zone with specific tactics drawn from a library of human predator management strategies that stretched back thousands of years, because humanity had been dealing with dangerous animals since before it had fire, and Carlos Rivas knew his history. In the mountain regions, he used ambush tactics borrowed from old Earth wolf hunts, funneling beasts through narrow passes where shooters waited on the high ground with clear sightlines to the skull base. In the plains, he used coordinated sweeps with trucks and drones that pushed beasts toward prepared kill zones, the way ancient humans had once driven bison over cliffs. In the forests, he deployed small hunter-killer squads of 3 to 5 people who moved quiet and fast and struck from concealment, because the forest was where the Zhrakval were most comfortable, and Rivas wanted them to learn that comfort was a lie. And in the cities, he built defensive rings with overlapping fields of fire and turned every rooftop into a sniper position, because any beast stupid enough to enter a human city was going to learn why humans had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of defending walls. Meanwhile, fabricators and engineers were doing what they did best, which was making things that killed other things more efficiently. A weapons factory in Puerto Nuevo began producing ethanol-tipped incendiary rounds that combined Dr. Herrera's discovery about the venom glands with a fragmentation design that could crack the bioceramic armor at the joint seams. And within a week, every militia unit on the planet had cases of ammunition specifically designed to destroy Zhrakval. A chemistry department at the University of Nueva Esperanza synthesized a pheromone compound from the glands of the dissected beasts that mimicked the scent of a wounded pack member, and when they tested it in the field, the Zhrakval came running toward it like moths to a flame, and ran straight into firing lines. Lucia Montero had stopped counting her kills after 15, because the number did not matter to her, as much as the fact that her neighbors were alive, and her land was still hers. But other people were counting for her, and her name was spreading across the network, like a song that everyone wanted to sing. A drone camera had caught footage of her 17th kill, and it was the one that made her famous, because her rifle had jammed after the first shot, which only wounded the beast, and instead of running, she had grabbed her compound bow from the rack on her truck and put a broadhead arrow through the gap in the creature's throat armor from 40 meters while it charged her, and the video was watched 11 million times in the first day. General Rivas gave her a field commission and command of a rural hunter-killer squad, accepted it the way she accepted everything, which was with a nod and no wasted words. And her squad became the most effective unit in the Eastern Plains, because Lucia knew the land better than any map, and she could read beast tracks the way her grandmother had read the weather. By the end of the second week, something extraordinary had happened, something that had never occurred in the entire history of the Zhrakval program. The beasts began to retreat. Their pack intelligence, which had been engineered to coordinate attacks and overwhelm defenders, was now telling them something that it had never had to process before. And the message was simple and clear. The humans are more dangerous than you. Zhrakval packs abandoned territories near human settlements and withdrew into the deep wilderness areas where the human presence was thin. And they moved at night, and they avoided open ground, and they did all the things that prey animals do when they are being hunted by. Something they cannot defeat. Dr. Tomas Herrera documented this behavior with the excitement of a scientist witnessing something unprecedented, and he wrote a paper about it that he titled, "On the Inversion of the Predator-Prey Dynamic, How Humanity Became the Apex," and he submitted it to the Galactic Scientific Extranet through a sympathetic Valori journalist who smuggled it past the Arxelian communication blockade. The paper spread across alien academic networks like wildfire, and it was read by military strategists and biologists and politicians on 100 different worlds, because it described something that challenged everything the galaxy believed about the natural order, which was that a species with no natural weapons, and no armor, and no venom, had taken the most lethal bioweapon in known space and turned it into prey in less than 2 weeks. In orbit above Nueva Esperanza, Grand Warlord Kethvaran could no longer call the situation a statistical anomaly. The numbers were undeniable, and they were getting worse every day. Of the original 40,000 Drakvol dropped on the planet, fewer than 18,000 were still alive, and the number was falling at a rate that his analysts described as catastrophic. And for the first time in his long career, Kethvaran felt something cold move through his chest that he did not recognize, because he had never felt it before. It was doubt. His advisors urged caution and patience and suggested that perhaps the humans could be brought to the negotiating table now that both sides had suffered losses. But Kethvaran was not a creature built for doubt or patience or negotiation, because his entire empire was built on the principle that fear always won. And if fear did not win, then the empire meant nothing. "Send the second wave," he ordered. 20,000 more. General Vraxis protested that the breeding reserves were limited and that replacing 60,000 Drakvol would take decades of genetic work, and Kethvaran silenced him with a look that could have frozen a star. "If 20,000 more cannot break them, then we will know something important," he said. "And if that happens, I will deal with it personally." The second wave of drop pods launched from the bioships and fell toward Nueva Esperanza like iron rain, and on the surface below, the humans watched them come, and they did not run, and they did not pray, and they did not beg. The second wave of Drakvol hit the atmosphere of Nueva Esperanza on the 23rd day, and 20,000 fresh killing machines screamed down through the sky in their iron pods, and slammed into the earth across all 3 continents, and burst out ready to do what they were born to do. They lasted an average of 4 hours each. The humans had spent 3 weeks learning and preparing and building, and they had turned their entire planet into a machine designed to do one thing, and that thing was to kill Drakvol as fast and efficiently as possible. And the second wave walked out of their pods and straight into the jaws of that machine. In the eastern plains, Lucia Montero and her hunter-killer squad were waiting at a drop zone that General Rivas had predicted using trajectory analysis of the incoming pods. And when the first beast crawled out of its smoking crater, Lucia put a round through its skull base before it had taken 3 steps, and her squad killed 11 more in the next 10 minutes, and they did it so cleanly that the whole engagement looked less like a battle and more like a morning at a shooting range. In the northern mountains, a militia unit used pheromone lures to draw an entire pack of 40 freshly dropped beasts into a box canyon, and then collapsed the canyon walls with mining explosives, and buried them under 1,000 tons of rock, without firing a single shot. In the city of Bahia Larga, a beast that somehow made it past the outer defense ring was killed by a retired schoolteacher named Abuela Carmen, who hit it in the eye with a crossbow bolt from her apartment balcony, while her grandchildren watched from behind the couch, and the video was viewed 20 million times before sunset. 8,000 Drakvol died in the first 48 hours of the second wave, and the rest scattered into the wilderness, where the first wave survivors had already learned to hide, and the combined beast population on the planet dropped below 12,000, and it kept falling every day. And then something happened that horrified the Arxelians more than any military defeat could have, because it was something that no species had ever done in response to the Drakvol, and it was something that revealed a truth about humanity that the galaxy was not ready to hear. The humans started having fun. It began in the small towns and farming communities, where the militia units had been hunting beasts for weeks, and it started as dark humor, which is the kind of humor that humans create when they are exhausted and afraid and angry all at the same time, because laughter was the weapon that no one could take away from them. Kill tallies appeared on barn walls, painted in bright red, like sports scoreboards, and settlements began competing with each other for the highest weekly count. And a radio host in San Marcos started a daily show called Beast Watch, where hunters called in to describe their kills. Listeners voted on the most creative method. A group of university students in Puerto Nuevo organized the first official Jacques hunt as a sporting event with teams and referees, and a trophy made from a beast's fang mounted on a wooden plaque. And 3,000 people showed up to watch, and they cheered every kill like it was a goal in a football match. A brewery in the mountain town of Sierra Alta released a limited edition dark ale called Sangre de Bestia, which meant blood of the beast, and the label featured a cartoon Jacques running away from a woman with a rifle, and it sold out in 6 hours and became the most popular drink on the planet. Teenagers live-streamed their hunts on the planetary network, with music playing in the background, and commentary that ranged from professional to absurd. And one crew of 4 kids from a farming settlement became famous for hunting a beast, while one of them narrated the whole thing in the style of a wildlife documentary, complete with whispered descriptions of the creature's behavior right up until the moment they shot it. Lucia Montero did not participate in the celebrations because she was too busy doing the work, but she did allow herself a small smile when her squad painted their truck with the words La Cazadora y los Lobos, which meant the huntress and the wolves. And the name stuck, because names have power, and this one felt right. On day 31, she led her squad on an operation that would become the stuff of legend, a night hunt through the Cañón del Diablo, where intelligence reported an alpha pack of 30 Zrakvol had established a den in the deep caves. They went in at midnight with night vision and suppressed rifles, and they moved through that canyon like ghosts made of purpose. And Lucia tracked the pack by their heat signatures and their claw marks on the rock walls, and the faint chemical smell of their venom. And she positioned her squad at the canyon's 3 exits, and she fired a pheromone lure into the cave mouth, and she waited. The beasts came out in a wave of armor and teeth and fury, and they ran straight into overlapping fields of fire from 3 directions. And it took 11 minutes to kill all 30 of them, and not a single member of Lucia's squad received so much as a scratch. General Rivas reviewed the operation footage and said 2 words: promote her. By day 35, the Zrakvul population on Nueva Esperanza had dropped below 5,000, and they were dying faster than they could flee. And Governor Vasquez stood in front of a camera in her office and sent an open broadcast on all frequencies that she knew the Arxelian fleet would intercept. Grand Warlord Ketharon, she said, with a smile that had no warmth in it whatsoever, on behalf of the people of Nueva Esperanza, I would like to thank the Arxelian Dominion for the most exciting hunting season in colonial history. And we would like you to know that you are welcome to send more at any time, because my people could use the exercise. Aboard the Fang of Arxis, Ketharon watched the broadcast, and he did not speak for a very long time, because the cold thing in his chest that he had not recognized before had grown larger and heavier, and he now understood what it was. It was fear. And it was not fear of the humans themselves, but fear of what the humans represented. Because if this Zrakvul could be defeated by a species that the Dominion had classified as primitive, then the entire foundation of Arxelian power was a lie. He had spent 60,000 Zrakvul on this planet, decades of genetic engineering, the pride of the Dominion's biological weapons program, and a species with no claws and no armor had turned them into a sporting event and a beer label. His generals urged withdrawal because the fleet's position was becoming politically untenable as Dr. Herrera's paper spread through the galaxy and other tributary species began to whisper about what had happened on Nueva Esperanza. But Ketharon was not a creature who knew how to retreat, because retreating was something that prey did, and he had never been prey. Prepare every remaining Zrakvul in the Dominion reserves, he said, and his voice was quiet and flat and empty. 50,000, all of them, every last one we have, and prepare the ground invasion force, because we are going to that planet, and we are going to finish this with our own hands." General Vraxis asked if this was wise, and Kethvarin turned to look at him, and something in the warlord's eyes made Vraxis step backward. "If we do not break them now, then every species we have ever conquered will see that we can be beaten," Kethvarin said. "And if they see that, then the Dominion falls. So we do not have the luxury of wisdom, we only have the necessity of victory." The order went out, and the last of the Arxelian war machine began to move toward Nueva Esperanza, and Governor Vasquez received intelligence about the incoming force, and she sat in her office for 1 minute in silence. And then she composed a message to Earth. It read, "We have handled the animals, but the lizards are coming in person now, and we could use some fleet support when you get a chance. No rush, we will keep the lights on for you." She sent it, and then she poured herself a glass of sangre de bestia, and raised it toward the window where the stars were shining cold and bright, and she drank it down, and got back to work, because there was still a war to win, and she was not the kind of woman who waited for someone else to win it for her. The third wave fell on day 46, and it was the largest deployment of Jraq Vol in the history of the Arxelian Dominion. 50,000 beasts launched in a rain of iron that darkened the sky over Nueva Esperanza, like an eclipse made of falling death. And behind them came the troop transports, carrying 80,000 Arxelian ground soldiers in full combat armor, because Kethvarin had decided that if his beasts could not break humanity, then his army would. The beasts hit the ground, and they died. They died in the plains where militia units had prepared kill zones with overlapping fields of fire and pheromone traps and explosive barriers that channeled them into corridors of destruction. And they died in the mountains, where hunters waited on every ridge with specialized ammunition and thermal scopes, and the patience of people who had been killing these things for 6 weeks. And they died in the forests, where Lucia Montero and 100 other squad leaders had mapped every trail and valley and choke point and turned the wilderness into a labyrinth that only had one exit, and that exit was a bullet. 11 days it took to destroy the largest Jraq Vol force ever assembled, and by the end of it, the humans were not even excited about the kills anymore, because it had become routine, the way harvesting wheat was routine, just another task that needed doing before dinner. The Arxelian ground troops landed on day 48, expecting to find a broken population cowering behind barricades while the beasts did the real work. And what they found instead was something that their training had never prepared them for, because their training was based on fighting species that were afraid of the Jraq Vol, and the humans were not afraid of anything anymore. The Arxelian soldiers were disciplined and well-equipped, and they were not cowards, but they had spent their entire military careers fighting enemies who had already been terrorized by the beasts. Before the soldiers ever arrived, enemies whose spirit was broken and whose will to resist had been eaten alive by weeks of horror, and they had no experience whatsoever fighting an enemy that was angry and organized and battle-hardened, and that looked at them with the calm eyes of peoples who had recently killed things much scarier than Arxelian infantry. General Rivas had anticipated the ground invasion, and he had spent 2 weeks preparing for it, and the strategy he deployed was simple and brutal, because Carlos Rivas did not believe in complicated plans when simple ones worked better. He let the Arxelians land and establish their forward bases, and then he hit them from every direction at once, with militia units that had spent 6 weeks learning how to move fast and strike hard, and disappear into terrain they knew like their own heartbeat. The Arxelians were trained for open battle and formation warfare, and they did not know how to fight an enemy that appeared from nowhere and vanished again, and that turned every building into a fortress and every road into an ambush. And they especially did not know how to fight an enemy that charged toward them when fired upon, instead of retreating, because in the entire history of Arxelian warfare, no species had ever run toward their guns. Lucia Montero and her squad transitioned from beast hunting to counter-infantry operations without missing a step, because the skills were the same: patience and precision and the willingness to sit in the dark for hours, waiting for the right moment, and then acting with absolute violence when that moment came. She led the assault on an Arxelian forward operating base near the Cañón del Diablo on day 52, the same canyon where she had killed 30's Rockvol in one night, and her squad and 3 others hit the base from 4 sides at dawn and overwhelmed the garrison in 40 minutes, and captured enough Arxelian weapons and equipment to supply an entire base. Militia Battalion. The Arxelian soldiers had never seen anything like her. A human woman who moved through the battlefield like smoke, and who shot with a precision that their targeting computers could not match. And the ones who survived the assault told stories about her that grew larger with every retelling, until the Arxelian troops began to believe that La Cazadora was not one woman, but an entire unit, or perhaps a ghost, or perhaps something worse. On day 54, the 3rd Colonial Fleet from Earth arrived in system, 200 warships dropping out of faster-than-light travel in tight formation like a fist made of steel and fire. And they found the Arxelian fleet in orbit above Nueva Esperanza, and the battle that followed was short and decisive, because Kethvaran had committed most of his resources to the ground campaign, and his orbital forces were spread thin. The flagship Fang of Arxis tried to run, and the human cruiser Santiago cut across its escape route and fired a single warning shot that took out the flagship's engines with surgical precision. And then the human marines boarded. They found Kethvaran in his command room, standing alone, because his officers had already surrendered. And the Grand Warlord, who had conquered 200 star systems and broken 43 species, stared at the human soldiers who came through his door, and he saw in their eyes the same thing he had seen in the surveillance footage from Nueva Esperanza, which was the absolute absence of fear. He surrendered without a word, because there was nothing left to say. The aftermath unfolded the way that avalanches unfold, slowly at first, and then all at once. 3 tributary species of the Arxelian Dominion declared independence within a month of Kethvaran's capture, emboldened by the proof that the Dominion's power was built on a bluff that a single human colony had called, and within 6 months the Dominion had fractured into a dozen squabbling factions, remnants that would never again threaten anyone. The Galactic Council formally censured the Arxelian Dominion for the illegal deployment of biological weapons against a civilian population, and in the same session they voted unanimously to open membership discussions with humanity. And the vote was unanimous, not because every species liked humans, but because every species had watched what happened on Nueva Esperanza, and had decided that they would rather have humans as allies than as enemies. Dr. Tomas Herrera received an invitation to lecture at the Valori Academy of Sciences, which was the most prestigious scientific institution in known space, and he traveled there on a diplomatic ship and stood before an auditorium filled with alien scholars who had spent their careers studying predator-prey dynamics, and he began his lecture with a line that would be quoted for centuries. "The Arxelians made a very common mistake," he said. "They saw that humans had no claws and no armor and no venom, and they concluded that we were not predators. But they failed to notice that on our homeworld we hunted every single apex predator to the edge of extinction. And we did not do this because we were hungry or because we were threatened. We did it because it was a Tuesday." The auditorium was silent for a very long time after that. General Carlos Rivas retired for the 2nd time and returned to his teaching position at the military academy on Tierra Firme, and he wrote a book about the campaign that became required reading at every human military institution. And when his students asked him what the most important lesson of Nueva Esperanza was, he always said the same thing: never let someone else decide that you are prey. Governor Elena Vasquez served 3 more terms, and oversaw the rebuilding of every settlement that had been damaged in the attacks. And she kept a Zrakvul Fang on her desk as a paperweight, and whenever foreign diplomats asked about it, she smiled and said it was a souvenir from the best hunting season the colony had ever had. Lucia Montero went home. She walked back to her farmhouse on the eastern plains, where the wheat was growing tall and golden in the sun, because the fields did not care about wars or aliens or monsters. The fields only cared about rain and soil and time. And she hung her rifle above the fireplace next to a Zrakvul Fang that was longer than her forearm, and she sat on her porch, and she poured a glass of Sangre de Bestia, and she watched the sunset paint the sky in copper and amber, just like it had on the night the pods fell. She was tired, and she was scarred in places that did not show, and she had lost friends and neighbors who would never come home. But the land was hers, and the sky was clear, and the only sound was the wind moving through the wheat, and somewhere far away, a bird singing as if nothing had ever gone wrong. She drank her beer, and she watched the light fade, and she breathed in the smell of her land, and she was at peace. Across the galaxy, in 100 alien war rooms and intelligence centers and military academies, strategists and analysts quietly opened their files on the species known as Homo sapiens, and they deleted the old assessments that described humans as young and primitive and technologically unremarkable, and they replaced them with new ones. The new assessments varied in language and format, because every species had its own way of expressing things, but they all said the same thing in one way or another. And on many worlds, the entry was flagged in red, because red was the color of warnings in most civilizations. The entry read, "Do not attempt to intimidate this species. Do not deploy biological weapons against their worlds. Do not invade their territory. Do not threaten their families. Do not assume that their lack of natural weaponry indicates weakness. If conflict with humans becomes unavoidable, then negotiate immediately and accept whatever terms they offer, because the alternative is worse than you can imagine. They are not prey. They have never been prey. And any species that makes the mistake of treating them as prey will learn this lesson exactly once."